I am super happy to have Dean Cheng back with us. He's actually I hate calling somebody an institution, but because I don't like being called. But he's with the U.S. Institute of Peace now, and he's probably one of the foremost experts on China, space, lawfare. In fact, his short brief on Chinese, what is actually Chinese lawfare, is still the basic document that you want to look at in that regard. But and I also, as mentioned, Dean, I love the fact that he doesn't mind that if we eat during his presentation. So without further ado, click on his bio. But without further ado, here's Dean. Dean, thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, good morning. It is a great honor to be here on the 30th anniversary of Lens. I think this may be my 10th time doing this, maybe even more. And so I thought that this might be an interesting time to think of this as a brief retrospective, not on Lens per se, but how far China has come in the past 30 years of the Lens conference. At one level, basic capabilities-wise, submitted for your consideration. In 1995, the Chinese Navy had 18 destroyers. It had still 160 torpedo boats, something that John F. Kennedy would have been familiar with. The PLA Air Force in 1995 had about 25 Su-27 flanker-type fighter aircraft. It had 3,000 J-6 Farmers, which is the equivalent of the MiG-19. To give you a sense, and this is 1995, the MiG-19 was contemporary to the American F-100 Super Sabre. It had 500 J-7 MiG-21s. This was the Chinese military we confronted in 1995. The Chinese economy, on a good day, was still probably not in the top 20 economies of the world. There was an earlier excellent presentation on space. In 1995, we were still working with the Chinese to launch American satellite payloads on Chinese rockets. Fast forward to today. In 2025, and this is by no means a comprehensive overview, just to give you a sense, the Chinese Navy today has 3 aircraft carriers, 31 Type 052D destroyers, which are comparable to the U.S. Arleigh Burke class, our cutting-edge destroyers, 6 Type 55 cruisers, which are comparable roughly to a Ticonderoga class, but actually is more recently built and more modern. And that is by no means the entire Chinese Navy. That's just the destroyers and cruisers. So they have literally dozens and dozens of frigates and no more motor torpedo boats. The PLA Air Force has 450 J-11s, which is the equivalent of the Su-27. They have 600 J-10s, which is sort of F-16-like fighter, and over 300 J-20 fifth generation fighter aircraft. From being a nation that might be able to launch somebody else's satellites, China today fields complete constellations across all the major portfolios. They were the 3rd nation to deploy a position navigation and timing constellation after GPS and GLONASS. They did it ahead of Europe. They have a human-rated spaceflight program, which Europe does not have. The earlier speaker on space, I would politely disagree with him. China does not have a proliferated low Earth orbit constellation comparable to Starlink. They are deploying 3 PLEO constellations, each currently projected to be over 15,000 satellites. And in fact, the Chinese are pretty explicit and say we are competing with, and hopefully will drive out of business, Mr. Elon Musk and Starlink in terms of providing internet satellite bandwidth around the world to a range of customers. So with this growth, there are nonetheless certain points of constancy. From the Chinese Communist Party's perspective, their core interests have not changed. The core interests remain. 1, keeping the CCP in power. 2, what the Chinese term national sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is why Taiwan matters. Taiwan is not going away as an issue anytime soon. But also why Tibet is an issue, why Xinjiang is an issue. And finally, sustained economic growth. Because as the CCP leadership understands, staying in power is only partly a function of repression and authoritarianism. Whether you call it the Gestapo or the Ministry of State Security or the KGB, that can only get you so far. And whether you call it the Great Firewall or whether you think of it as simply censorship, that can only get you so far if the population itself does not think you are doing anything for them. And since 1949, the implicit and sometimes explicit bargain has been, we the CCP are in charge, not because I promise that you will live better under our rule, but we promise that your children and your grandchildren will live better under our rule. And if you were 18 years old in 1949, 1, you'd be quite old now, but 2, in your lifetime, you saw a nation that in 1949 was maybe 20% literate in a society and culture that has long valued education, to a time when your children and grandchildren all are literate, all have longer life expectancy, live in houses that now not only have the wonder of an electric light bulb, but refrigerators and air conditioners and cell phones. You pull out your cell phone and you can make doctor's appointments and order Kung Pao chicken and get a taxi cab. That's all in your lifetime. That's pretty much doing what the party doing what it promised that it would do. And in exchange, all they ask is that you obey, that you don't riot, that you love your country, and therefore love the CCP, because the two are the same, in the CCP's view. So Xi Jinping came to power in the middle of the past 30 years, when Lens has been around. So let's think about this a little bit. Xi Jinping comes to power in 2012. In doing so, he overturned many of the constraints on the CCP itself that had been put in place by his predecessor, Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping said, the most important position in China is General Secretary of the CCP, and that person should pay attention to age. As you get to be older, you should prepare to step down. And Xi Jinping said, nah. Second most important position in China is being President of the People's Republic of China. By the way, that's usually the same person. And they, under the Constitution of the People's Republic of China, should only be in place for 2 terms. And Xi Jinping amended the Chinese Constitution, which is why, as of today, he is still in power. In 2025, he is 3 years into his 3rd term. And he is certainly over the age that Deng had envisioned for people to step down as head of the CCP. Among other things that Xi has also succeeded in doing is to enshrine Xi Jinping thought, that's the literal term, alongside Mao Zedong thought and Deng Xiaoping theory within the Chinese CCP's constitution. The reason why this matters is because, 1, it is saying to the party which runs the country, because what matters in China is the CCP, not the government per se, but the party, that his thoughts are equal to those of Mao and Deng and actually eclipse Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Because as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, especially if you've heard me drone on in previous sessions, the top Chinese leaders were Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping. So Xi Jinping is more important than the people that Deng Xiaoping designated as his own successors. And if he is going to overturn Deng Xiaoping thought, then in that case, how can he justify that? The answer, well, I'm actually more important than the people he designated. And Xi Jinping has put forth the China dream. And what is the China dream? He himself describes this, the CCP describes it, the great revival of the Chinese people. Or, to put it in terms that everyone in this room will understand, to make China great again. That sounds like a joke. It sounds like the speaker's being flippant. It's not. Because the point here is that China is not a newly emerging power. China is a returning power. China was a great power for most of the last 5 millennia, 5,000 years. It fell. It fell in 1842 after the First Opium War through the Century of Humiliation. But we're back. And to you in the West, thank you for keeping our seats warm. Thank you for developing a whole lot of technologies. So it was for the previous speakers, there was a question about supply chains. China is very happy being part of your Western supply chains. It is part of what has helped China become a greater industrial power, but it is also a key pathway for China to become the dominant great power. And that, in fact, is one of Xi Jinping's great achievements over the last 13 years. The last 13 years, if you look at where China was in 2012 and where China is today, Xi Jinping can point to a number of things that China has achieved. It has grown in science and technology. China is the first country to land on the far side of the moon and to bring back samples. China was the first country to land on the lunar South Pole. Prior to 2021, every picture from Mars was courtesy of NASA. Our understanding of Mars, our pictures from Mars, were all American. But in 2021, China did something incredible. China landed on Mars on the first try. No other country, not us, not the Soviets, not the Russians, not the Europeans, successfully evaded Martian air defense on the first try and landed. And that is a huge moment of pride for the Chinese, to land on another planet at all, but to do something that nobody else could do on the first try. And by the way, something which Europe has yet to do, to land on Mars and beam back pictures. Think about that, right? 1842, China is prostrate before the guns and the muskets of the British military, and later the French military, and the Japanese military, and the American military. And today, China is doing things that Europe and Russia and Japan cannot do. Alongside this has been the growth, of course, in China's economy. It is the #2 GDP in the world. And while it built upon trade to do so, the policies of Xi Jinping, as enunciated, are signaling that that is changing. And by the way, they were starting to change before Donald Trump became president the first time. So this is not because of Donald Trump. In 2015, the Chinese put forth something called Made in China 2025. It identified 10 technology areas where China said, we want to be 80% or more self-sufficient. Some of these are technologies that will not surprise anyone in this room. Microchips, semiconductors, right? No surprise. Robotics, no surprise. Railway technology, ocean shipping, agricultural machinery. This is old smokestack industry stuff. But understand, you don't get a bobblehead doll to the shelves of Walmart. You don't get a Cisco router into your IT department without relying at the end of the day on railways and merchant shipping, somewhere along the line. And I hope you're all enjoying your lunch. That is courtesy of agricultural machinery. So what China is basically saying is we want to be self-sufficient in advanced technology areas, but also foundational, old-fashioned, boring, but vital smokestack industries. And we hopefully will achieve such a dominance that you will be dependent on us. And that is all part of Xi Jinping's policies. Since we're here talking about legal warfare and this is a legal discussion, one of the other areas that China has been pushing is the creation of industrial norms and political standards in key areas, including the maritime, the cyber, and outer space. And I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, that those three arenas also happen to be mission areas given to the People's Liberation Army as part of the new historic missions. In 2004, Hu Jintao said to the PLA, here are some of the key jobs for you. Number one, keep the party in power. Two, be prepared to take Taiwan if necessary. And the political leadership, will tell you when that is necessary. But three, secure Chinese interests in three key domains: the maritime, outer space, and electromagnetic/information space/cyber. So what has Xi Jinping done? In the maritime domain, we've seen, as the previous panel discussed, South China Sea, not just island building, but a challenge to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and international waters about what are the legal obligations and rights within exclusive economic zones. Are exclusive economic zones national territorial waters that other people have the right to transit through? That's the Chinese version. Or are they international waterways where the owning state gets first right of refusal over the resources, which is the Western version? And as we watch things continue to be tense in the South China Sea, part of that clash is this clash between fundamental legal understandings. In the information domain, we are watching the Chinese, in terms of supply chains, pushing hardware and software. We always focus on supply chains of hardware, but there's a software supply chain too. A bunch of you folks have computers open. What time is it? If you look on your computer, there's a little thing that'll tell you what time it is. That's a program. Where did that program come from? Who wrote it? How many hands has it gone through? How many companies has it gone through? Do you know, as a user, you're hopefully smart enough not to answer the Nigerian prince's offer of a bank settlement. But do you know where your clock program came from on your computer? This is the sort of thing that is part of the information space domain, the cyber domain, that China is pushing. And today, you can now buy a Chinese laptop, good price, that runs a Chinese operating system. No longer are you tied to Microsoft or Linux. And finally, in outer space, we are watching the Chinese talk about cislunar space. We're talking about the Chinese establishing a presence on the moon. And something to think about here, especially because, and this is not a partisan comment, Mr. Musk has argued that moon's kind of boring. Mars is where it's at. He may be right. But consider two things. One, you probably have to go through cislunar space, the volume of space between the Earth and the moon, in order to get to Mars. But two, if there is a Chinese lunar outpost that is manned, which the Chinese are talking about, and the Chinese do 4 missions a year to the moon, rotating, and we do 1 mission a year to Mars simply due to distance, what do you think the language of space traffic management is? Because right now, if you take off from Barcelona and fly to Bangkok, the language in the cockpit and at every air traffic control center along the way is English. Doesn't matter what airline you are, doesn't matter what nationality you are, your pilots and the air traffic controllers must know how to speak English. Why? Because back in the 40s when the rules were being written, the United States was the largest presence in civil aviation. If China has the largest number of astronauts, even if it's all short haul, in orbit, going to the moon, and we're up there sometimes, what's the argument that, but of course everyone's going to speak English? That has cultural security implications. That has political implications. If every space traffic controller, American, Australian, Spanish, has to learn Chinese, what does that do in terms of a global sense of power and authority? So it's been an eventful 30 years. My congratulations to Lens for making it to 30 and hopefully for many, many more. It's been an even longer period for the Chinese. I hope that Xi Jinping doesn't see 30 years in power. I wouldn't bet against that, however. But the point here is that for the foreseeable future, the Chinese will be a factor on legal issues, on ethics issues, certainly on national security issues, and at that nexus point of legal warfare. Because legal warfare is part of political warfare, is part of how the Chinese are shaping how we think about the question and what language that question is going to be considered in. And hopefully one of the takeaways from this, hopefully one of the takeaways from the broader discussion here is a recognition that it's not all about bombs and bites, but also about the law and legality as one of the battlefields that we confront the Chinese on. Thank you very much.
Well, Dean has graciously agreed to answer a few questions.
Absolutely.
I'm trying not to dominate all the questions like I've been doing, unfortunately, but let me start off with what about is it a bromance between Putin and Xi Jinping, or is it something else? And well, we'll go with that, and then we'll be thinking your questions. Sometimes I call on people who don't have to raise their hand, especially if they're Lens scholars. So if you're a Lens scholar, start thinking your question.
I keep thinking you should give me the ability to give like 2 points worth of CLE, and that'll hopefully get people to ask questions. What is the Xi-Putin relationship? First off, you hear a lot about limitless friendship. That's nonsense. I'm sorry. Now, one of the things that Ambassador Coe,
Dean Coe.
Dean Coe. I'm not that kind of Dean. Dean Coe said was, the United States doesn't lie. Leave that statement alone. I will point out, other nations do. So what is the relationship between Putin and Xi? They both dislike us. They both are opposed to the West, but they oppose the West very differently. I'm not a Russia scholar, but my observation is the Russians are comfortable with chaos. The Chinese, as a society, you know that old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times? First off, do not take advice from a fortune cookie. But two, what it really is may you live in unpredictable times. That is a curse, because from a societal perspective, that's terrifying. China believes in a rules-based international order. Their question is, who wrote the rules? And again, in what language? If you want to see a more limitless friendship, and still not completely limitless, that's Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un. Because nothing says I love you like I will send tens of thousands of my young men to go and die in your war. Okay. There is no evidence at this time that there are Chinese munitions being fired from Russian artillery or Chinese rockets being launched from Russian soil. There's no evidence that there are Chinese J-11s being flown by Russian pilots, never mind Chinese pilots. That should give us a sense of what is the state of relations. Does that mean that Xi is ready to sell out Putin or Putin is ready to sell out Xi? No, because they both agree we're the problem and we're the bad guys. But we do ourselves few favors if we think that these two have a bromance, that they're, the next step is to do a buddy movie. Because that one's gonna fail at the box office. Second weekend, complete drop off.
And I just wanted to ask, speaking of unpredictability, of course.
Like that microphone.
Yeah.
Like that, but even more so, speaking of unpredictability, what changes do you think we'll see come from this current administration versus the last administration when dealing with China, countering them? What's changing here?
Well, you know, the funny thing about that is that if you're the Chinese and you look at Trump 1, Biden, and Trump 2, you're actually not expecting many changes. Why does he say that? Because Trump 1.0 imposed tariffs, an unprecedented act by any president since Harry Truman. How many of those, first, how many things did Donald Trump 1.0 do that Joe Biden reversed? 1, 2, 20, 50, number keeps going up, right? You know what he didn't change? Tariffs on China. Not one tariff got rescinded or even cut back. And now, Donald Trump comes in, and what does he talk about? He's talking about, oh, on top of the tariffs I already imposed, and the 10% I'm going to put on the Chinese for being Chinese, I'm now talking, as of yesterday, about another 10% and maybe another 10% next week. So the unpredictability is how high is he going to go, but not does any American president like China. If you are Beijing, the answer to that is no. There may not be a bromance between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, but from the Chinese view, there is a distinct Lex Luthor villain who changes actors from movie to movie, but is always the same Lex Luthor with regards to China. Yep.
Let's go right in the middle here.
You spoke briefly about kind of the long historical life of the Chinese civilization. And I know specifically in the Pacific, those historical reasons are named for, I guess, their claims to certain territorial waters. In contrast, the United States is a very young nation, and a lot of the conversation we have on our end about those issues is about kind of not necessarily imposing, but backing new norms and kind of what our view is of customary international law. Do you think we're speaking somewhat of a different language in that sense in those diplomatic conversations? And if so, is there a way we can kind of bridge the gap?
So a couple of disclaimers here. One, I am in a room filled with lawyers, legal scholars, law students. I have none of those qualifications. I'm not a lawyer nor a law student. And I'm supposed to retire, so I'm not going to rectify either of those conditions. Two, 我们绝对是在用不同的语言来讨论. We are absolutely using different languages rooted in fundamentally different concepts of the role of law. So at another lecture, I was politely informed by a lawyer that there is actually a Latin term for this, rex lex versus lex rex, the rule of law and rule by law. China, across thousands of years of civilization, has always been ruled by law. We in the West, inheritors of the British common law tradition, et cetera, are rule of law. That has huge implications for your fundamental interpretation of the applicability and how it is applied of these sorts of things. Are we talking past each other? Yes, because the third piece is, for the Chinese, legal warfare has nothing to do with the law. Nothing to do with determining what is legal based upon doctrines and stare decisis and all the rest. And I have now exhausted my knowledge of Latin legal terms. It has everything to do with using the law as an institution, legal courts, treaties, et cetera, to get to where I wanted to go in the first place strategically. It's a whole lot of chucking stuff at the wall and seeing what'll stick. Let me give you a legal reason for why you should let me take Palawan or the Spratlys or Ho Chi Minh City. You don't like that one? It's a little bit like Groucho Marx. I have lots of principles. If you don't like the ones I give you, I have many more to offer. If you don't like those legal principles, how about these? How about those? The point is to get to what I want, not what is the legal philosophy.
Masha.
So I'm Ukrainian American, and I was curious. A lot of Americans like to compare Ukraine and Taiwan. Taiwan is a little democratic country. China is big, non-democratic country. And I'm curious as to your opinion. What can Taiwan expect from the international community in the event of an invasion? Is an invasion likely, or is it all part of China posturing about the control it has in that region?
So first, Ukraine has one huge advantage over Taiwan. It is a recognized nation. It is a nation that Donald Trump, Keir Starmer, I'm not sure about Vladimir Putin, but Xi Jinping, all recognize as a country. It has a seat at the United Nations. Here's an interesting legal question for everyone in this room. What is the legal basis for intervening on behalf of Taiwan when not a single, I will make this bet, not a single person in this room comes from a country that recognizes Taiwan as a nation? So tell me, budding lawyers, what is your argument to the Secretary of State, the President of the United States, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, on the legal basis for putting Americans in harm's way to defend an entity that we do not recognize as a country? So why is China interested in Taiwan? Three broad things. One, century of humiliation. Taiwan was lost during the century of humiliation. Who is it lost to? It was lost to Japan, boo hiss, in 1894, the first Sino-Japanese War. It matters because it is part of the first island chain. For those of you who are old, sorry, it's true, and have Navy experience, you will remember something called the Greenland-Iceland-UK Gap. That is the line of islands that was going to keep the Soviet Red Banner Northern Fleet submarines from doing a, Operation Drumbeat on the supply lines connecting us and NATO during World War III. Rotate that about 45 degrees, and you have the first island chain: Japan, Okinawa, Taiwan, the Philippines, Straits of Malacca. It hems in the Chinese, unless it's in Chinese hands, in which case it fends us off. And then third, Taiwan builds a lot of chips. Notice that's number 3. If Taiwan produced watermelons, the Chinese would still want to take the island. So to your broad question, is Xi Jinping serious about taking Taiwan at some point? No. The CCP is serious, and the Chinese people are serious, because it's not a communist party, it's not a PRC goal. It is arguably a Chinese goal. And it is not clear, will the West stand up for Taiwan? Like I said, your homework assignment is please provide a 3-page legal brief to the National Command Authority arguing for or against intervening on behalf of a non-recognized entity.
I was going to go close here, but then we're going to go far next time.
So I got 2 points. The first, it's not a 3-page essay, but the argument I would make would be under the Montevideo Convention, the sovereign rights of peoples, and that the Taiwanese are a people. But I won't go any further than that because we don't have that time. As
the
far
82nd
as
Airborne will be jumping on Tibet soon, and also depending on who's in charge, perhaps into Gaza and on behalf of the Basques. I mean, that's an interesting argument. Woodrow Wilson is proud of you.
I appreciate that. Aside from that, looking to the future, this is more of an economics question, but it will inevitably impact everything else that China's doing. With the pending and almost seemingly inevitable falling of their population, how do you foresee their continued ability to conduct operations on Taiwan? What does it do to that timeline? And then also their ability to continue with their infrastructure development in both the Navy and the civilian side, keeping their population happy and making their military capable of competing with ours on the international stage. So yeah, how do you just foresee those factors impacting those results in the future?
So in a nutshell, demographics is about as flexible as the Titanic. If you are going to solve China's demographic problems, every person who will be 18 within the next 18 years has already been born. So you are not, if you went out there and got the Chinese to go back to the good old days of Mao, everybody needs to produce as many children as possible. You do not change the demographics for 18 years. So for the Chinese, that's actually good news in some ways. Why? In the 1995, China needed 8% economic growth every year simply to handle the number of 18-year-olds entering the workforce, because China's population was growing and you had huge numbers of 18-year-olds coming online every year. Now, for all the reasons you noted, China's population is potentially going to drop. We're talking about no more than millions and quite possibly only hundreds of thousands of new 18-year-olds coming online, which is why the Chinese themselves are talking about 3 to 4% economic growth a year, year on year. That's a 8% economic growth is hard. 3% economic growth is not easy, but you take a look at Europe, you take a look at us, you take a look at others, you can do that. So there's a giant sigh of relief that the demographics in some ways are more handleable. The flip side to that is you've got a huge problem of an upside-down population. Every worker has to support more and more retirees. But as a member of the Central Committee said to a friend of mine about 8 years ago in an interview, when he asked, look, you guys know your demographic problems far better than we do. Aren't you worried? And according to my friend, Central Committee member leaned across the table, adjusted his eyeglasses and said, that is a very American perspective. Do you know, Professor, what old people do not do? They don't riot. That's an interesting perspective. It's a very different perspective. It's one that says that if my job one is not economic growth, my job one is keeping the CCP in power, maybe my job is a little easier. So where does all this wind up? There's a reason the Chinese are working very hard on AI. There's a reason the Chinese are working very hard on robotics. Because in this regard, they are like the Japanese. Not that they will grow rich before they grow old, but one solution to a labor problem is having robots and AI do all the repetitive stuff and also clean bedpans and do that sort of thing. So it's an interesting incentivized AI robotics landscape that the Chinese are walking into.
Once you go far back, I want to make sure you're included, but Ryan?
Hello, Professor Brian Cox, Cornell Law School, and retired U.S. Army Judge Advocate. I was wondering if you could talk through some of the challenges that we see. You mentioned with communications technologies, so cyber, ICT, some of the vulnerabilities that we have domestically in the West, and then what are some of the offset strategies we've got to counter those? Thanks. So
one of the most fundamental problems we have is that we are an open architecture and an open system. So the Chinese recently unleashed a series of typhoons, no, not in terms of weather control, but Volt Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, and now Flax Typhoon. And basically one of these typhoons was an attack into our telecom system. If you believe the reports, and I do, and actually I suspect that this is the least bad parts, is the parts we're openly talking about. They penetrated things like Vice President Vance and President Trump's phones. They accessed wiretap data, not just criminal wiretaps of the Soprano family, but also FISA court surveillance, which means intelligence activities. How bad is that? I'd say that's pretty bad. I think it's Volt Typhoon, on the other hand, is the one where it turns out that unnamed third-party hackers from unidentified countries, large Asian, apparently installed malware across multiple key systems in the United States: power, communications, water, indicating in time of crisis or wartime, we may lose our power and our water in our communications, in our air traffic control system, in our railways. Think about what American society looks like 24 hours after that, 48 hours, 1 week after that. When we tried to get the Europeans to pull Huawei out of their systems, they kicked and screamed and said, who's going to pay for this? Apparently the idea that they would pay for it was not very popular. Apparently the idea that the Chinese might run amok in their system was something they weren't worried about. Where is the problem here? Well, obviously part of the problem is China. They're doing this. Part of the problem is us in the West. Either believing, but they would never do that. Or worse, we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. In the dark, on foot. Okay, aces. What are the countervailing aspects? There is some recognition that this is a problem. We are pulling Huawei out of our systems down at the third tier mom and pop telecoms that service rural areas. Okay, better late than never. One of the things we don't seem to recognize is that at some point in the near future, data will travel across Africa and South America to get to their final destination. And pulling Huawei out of Europe and the United States and never installing it in the first place in Japan doesn't solve the problem of China's presence in the physical layer in Africa, in South America, in Southeast Asia. Longer term, boo hiss to Donald Trump. Oh my gosh, he's going to destroy the international trading system. Again, I'm not here to make partisan comments, but if it is going to get us to wake up to the reality that the Chinese are pushing mercantilism not simply as a trade policy, but as a technology policy. I want you to run Chinese operating systems on the Lenovo computer that you bought at a 30% discount compared to HP. Hey, that's serious money here. And he is going to be the big meanie and says, you can't do that. And there was an earlier discussion about TikTok, and I will simply point out, I don't know where TikTok is going, but I'm not convinced that it's going to be here in its present form in 180 days. And if the Chinese answer is, it won't be here at all, because we will absolutely not allow you to have the data only be stored in the United States. I know a lot of people will be unhappy. Not so sure that that's a bad thing. One other quick observation. Red notebook. Cool. It's TikTok without being the TikTok label. Ha, I'm gonna pull a fast one on all those old fogies out there in Washington who don't know what the heck they're doing. Do you know what the Chinese characters are for red notebook? 小红书. Do you know what a different translation for 小红书 is? Little red book. Do you know what the sayings of Chairman Mao were called? This is not an accident. I do think that this is proof, however, that Chinese bureaucrats have a sense of humor. That there are all these people who are going to stick it to the man in the West by taking up 小红书 for all of their personal communications needs. Let me assure you, the Ministry of State Security appreciates your support.
We have time for one more. Ashley, what's your question?
With America's view on foreign aid and foreign development seemingly changing pretty dramatically recently, how does that benefit China in the long run? I know they're already being involved with foreign development for quite a bit of return on investment for themselves. I guess my question specifically is, how much time do we have to fix that error and that gap we're creating?
Okay, so your question actually needs to be broken into two big buckets. I'm sorry you're the last question because this is going to take a couple of minutes, so my apologies in advance. One, you have two buckets of Chinese investment. You have the money that represents the blood, sweat, and toil of the Chinese people, and this money cannot simply be frittered away on irrelevant or political goals. Do you know where that money is invested? North America, Europe, and Northeast Asia, and a couple of places in Southeast Asia like Singapore. Why? Rule of law, objective courts, known conflict resolution mechanisms. And then you have Belt and Road Initiative, which is what everyone talks about. Belt and Road Initiative is a jobs program for Chinese steel and cement plants to export stuff to third parties, because we have built literally bridges to nowhere, airports to nowhere, and ports to nowhere in China. And at some point, having individual ports, as in everybody, you get a port, and you get a port, and you get a port, and you get a port, is like, okay, we can't actually do that. So BRI is not actually expected to have a return on investment monetary-wise. If it does, cool. If it doesn't, all these people were employed for 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So we already got our return on investment. So one aspect here is, the Chinese are doing this, they're generating some goodwill, less over as time goes on. They are creating debt traps, which was never the objective, but if I can get one in the process, hey, that's cool. And also building out infrastructure that I can use, especially if I have to repossess your port or airport. What about US aid, not AID? What about US aid? Here's the problem with the, oh my gosh, we're now going to be behind the Chinese. We weren't ahead of the Chinese as of January 19th, 2023. Why does Dean Cheng say that? Because he used to work for the Heritage Foundation, a noted right-wing outfit? No. I say that because Lawrence Summers, president of Harvard University, noted right-winger in some quarters, I suppose, said, my experience has been, when we go abroad, we bring lectures. When the Chinese go abroad, they bring airports. The reality is, we don't build infrastructure. And that isn't Donald Trump's fault. That's not even Joe Biden's fault. We stopped building infrastructure as a part of national aid back in the 90s. We do provide ESG support, environment, social, and governance. You need to pay your people more. And you also need to obey global standards on the environment. And by the way, your corporate governance structure needs to be updated with better audits and transparency. Chinese show up and say, that 1 port or 2 ports you guys wanted, how much throughput do you want? So, our aid structure isn't aid. Our aid structure is finger wagging. It has been for decades. We were behind for that reason. Please note, not a defense of current Trump administration policies. That's a whole separate issue, which I would leave to Dean Coe, the other dean. My point here is to say, if our focus here is to talk about how can we do aid better to compete with the Chinese, then we need to think about what we want our aid to do. Because I will tell you that having had interactions with the successor to the Exim Bank, which I can never remember what it's called, it's the Overseas Investment Corporation, I think. They were tasked in the Biden administration to counter China by extending loans to companies to compete with Chinese infrastructure construction. Why? Because the US government doesn't build infrastructure, companies do. Brown and Root, Halliburton, et cetera. And when we went to interview those folks, their comment was, that's nice. My job is to push ESG. Countering China should not be the priority. If that is your attitude, guess what? You're not going to outcompete the Chinese.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Never not learned a ton from Dean. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.